We've covered the Mercury and Gemini, of course, and talked a little bit about how the control center was arranged, and we had the support rooms across the hall. They were called the back rooms. And some of the recording devices. So now we'll get down into the missions, starting with, let's see, where am I? Try turning this on. It is on. Okay. Apollo 7. And these were the 3 crew members. Wally Schirra was, of course, one of the original 7 with a phone in his car. Don Isley and Walt Cunningham were rookies. And the launch vehicle for Apollo 7 was this, because we were going into Earth orbit. We didn't have the lunar module. We weren't going into translunar coast. So the first 2 stages of what we call the Saturn 1B. And the first stage here was really about 8 engines strapped together. And we were in Earth orbit, and that's one of the videos. They did video, live video, and they used that sign. And I could not remember where that saying came from, and I looked it up. It was from the Dean Martin show. Any historians in the room? All right, at that point in October, and so we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Apollo 7. And in about October, I think it was maybe a little bit before Apollo 7 splashed, or right afterwards, the rumors started to circulate that Apollo 8 was going to be lunar. And of course, we were all excited. And I started that as a political decision for a couple of reasons. Mainly, it wasn't political at all. The lunar module was not ready. It wasn't ready for an orbital mission, which eventually became Apollo 9. And the Russians were gaining, or so our intelligence sources, so they thought. So we looked in, and I think this was at the level of a NASA administration. They started to toy with the idea, should we go lunar and just go up and around and back? And the ultimate decision was, if we're going that far, we're going into orbit. So we started to practice for that. And that was my all-time favorite mission. There's no question about it. Frank Borman was part of the second group. Jim Lovell was a veteran, as was Frank Borman. Bill Anders was a rookie. So what are our objectives for this one? And we've seen this slide before. We're going to leave Earth orbit for the first time ever. We're going to the moon. Are we going to have problems in the Van Allen radiation belt? We're going to go into lunar orbit. We're going to circularize. We're not going to do this. We're going to have to leave Earth, lunar orbit, and we're coming in. Now, we're not going to do a retrofire burn to slow down and coast into an ocean. No, we're coming in. And we're coming in fast. So I thought to use this slide from High Flight and call your attention to Apollo 8. We're going to slip Earth orbit. We're going where no one's ever been before. So we're going with the full up Saturn launch vehicle this time. Those are the 3 stages. First stage, and the fuel for that was liquid oxygen and RP1, which is another word for kerosene, hypergolics. Second stage was the fuel there was liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. And the third stage also liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. And the inertial unit and the guidance system for the launch system is in this ring right here. And of course the command module is up there in the launch escape tower, and the service module is there. So if we go back, and we've seen slides like this before, but all of this to take that to the moon. Okay, and where is it all assembled? That's interesting because that whole system is assembled in this building, which is still at the Cape and was used as well for the shuttle, all the shuttle launches, the vertical assembly building or vehicle assembly building. I just thought this was one of the greatest pictures in the world, so I included it. And then the assembly is put on this crawler and covers the 2.5 to 3 miles to the launch site. It's an amazing system. The building itself, there are the dimensions compared to the Empire State Building. There are days when it creates its own weather and it gets rain up at the top. The crawler here, now there's a good job. The weight of the crawler, not terribly fuel efficient. But it's like the computer, it does the job. And the next few pictures I just had to have. And in the book Apollo 8 by Jeffrey Klugger, he talks about Jim Lovell taking his wife, Marilyn, before a couple of days before launch on sort of a tour externally, and those were her words. The night before, they were visited by Charles Lindbergh, who made this comment. Now, I included these slides because I didn't know at the time I was going to have this video that I'm going to show you in just a couple of minutes. So this is a trace of the acceleration profile during launch. And of course, we start at liftoff. This point right here is where if you remember early on, there were 5 engines in that first stage. 4 and then 1 in the center. So this is where the center engine cuts off and the other 4 that take over, and then suddenly they all cut off and we go from 4 Gs down to less than 1. And you can imagine what kind of a ride that is, and Bill Anders will describe it. And then the second stage takes over and it's a much smoother. So this, anybody says that this is a picnic, it's quite a ride. And of course, acceleration, I say to my math folks, that's second derivative. How do we train for this? And I kept these 2 slides in because I like to use this for the high school and grammar school students. We train for high G forces in a centrifuge, which again is not a particularly pleasant ride. She does not look like she's ready to go to the prom. To simulate weightlessness, we fly these parabolic profile flights, and the airplane is called the Vomit Comet, because that invariably happens until the crew gets used to those differences between weightlessness and high Gs. All right, so there's our orchestra and training, or rather orchestra layout. We've seen this. And I want to now introduce us to some of the flight controllers. Booster, these gentlemen, we'll go through each of these characters because some of them are indeed, or were indeed, characters. Frank Van Rensselaer. And I think, I asked him one time, because of course the name, and I think it was his grandfather, or great-grandfather, that founded the college. Good engineering school. John Llewellyn. Now there was an interesting guy. He was a renegade. He delighted in chewing gum all the time, and when he wanted to take a break, he'd put it behind his ear. And of course, fortunately, he had 2 ears. And then there was a story that he got crosswise with the administration one time over parking. I guess he parked on the lawn or something. Anyway, they quarantined his car. So he said, all right, well, fine, I'll take my horse. And he rode his horse to them. Renegade, John, but smart. William and Mary. Fido. Jay Green was from Brooklyn, had that Brooklyn accent. Great to talk to. Go Big 12. Steve Bales. Gary Cohn, my supervisor. Ecom, John Aaron, you'll meet him next in Apollo 13. Not Apollo 12 and 13. Yeah, now that's interesting. Yeah. And that's the government issue. Did I tell you the story about, I told you we were restoring. Yeah. Did I tell you, though, that I talked to the archive lady, and she said, yeah, we're going to have cigarette butts. You know, the call is out, collect your cigarette butts. That's funny. We smoked a lot and drank an awful lot of coffee. Yes?
I imagine someone taking a tour, and then the tour guide just says, and these are genuine cigarette butts from the team.
I'll email Ms. Tetley and give her that idea. Yes. Thank you. And Capcom, as I say, was always an astronaut. And flight director, Cliff Charlesworth. Now, the first time I showed this slide was last August to my Southwest faculty, and I said, Mississippi College, where's Mississippi College? And somebody in the back said, it's in Mississippi. Well, it's a small Baptist college in Jackson. It's the oldest college in the state and the second oldest Baptist affiliate college in the country. So what do these guys all have in common besides they're all white men? Bachelor's degrees. That's it. And a lot of them were in their 20s. And they got out of school and there was an ad for NASA and they said, well, I'll try it. And the rest is history. They were sharp problem solvers, thought on their feet, well, just sharp guys. In fact, some of us Air Force guys were the few that had masters. These guys all had bachelors. So it can be done. Yes?
Are all those still alive?
No, unfortunately. We've lost Cliff, Gary, Jay Green, and John Llewellyn, and I don't know about the others.
Was this all for Apollo 8?
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
so Collins was Capcom for
He was launch Capcom for Apollo 8, yes. Typical mission had 3 or 4 teams, but this was the launch team. All right, where's my slide, Jeremy? Is it next? Yeah. This is Apollo 8. Oh, that's ice.
Sideways shaking was unbelievable. The vibration was so intense you couldn't see the instrument panel. I thought we'd had it at a direct launch.
This is Bill Anders.
I was hoping that Frank Borman didn't have his hand on the port control. He said he took his hand off and he'd rather die than the false alarm.
1 minute after liftoff, the Saturn V is already supersonic.
Well, the Saturn V is still the most powerful machine that man has ever devised. 20 tons of fuel a second, 7.5 million pounds of thrust. I think we were all surprised at how strong that thing was. It had 2 or 3 empty missions for 4 hours, but it was a piece of cake. It just worked beautifully. Unbelievable.
5 engines in the first stage blast the Saturn V to 7 times the speed of sound.
The second stage cut it pretty fast.
At 40 miles high, it's still accelerating.
When you stage, you were flowing forward in the belts and then backward in the belts.
And I thought I was being catapulted through the instrument panel.
And the test was good. All engines, all circuits show the stage is running perfectly.
The third stage fires twice. First, the boost into orbit. The second burn takes the crew of Apollo 8 where no men have ever been, deep space.
There was no way that the first gravity could hold us back any longer. So we were on our way.
So again, that's the another version of that acceleration curve of what Bill Anders was referring to. It's being catapulted right through the instrument panel. Look at the change. And some views from Apollo 8. I'll let you read that. Linda, that's why I sent you that picture. That's a great read, by the way. And of course that iconic photo that Jeremy showed earlier. And this is Bill Anders' comment. Now if you want to take a picture of this or I can back up after we're finishing, you can jot that one down. One of those two, I think it's the bottom one, Earthrise 45th anniversary. That's the onboard conversation between the 3 crew members. They almost missed this shot because their mission was to photograph the lunar surface for landing purposes, to find out the best potential sites to land. And I'm paraphrasing now, but it went something like, "Oh my God, look at this! Get me that camera! Hand me the Hasselblad!" That's what they were using, and they caught that Earthrise. But I mean. They weren't looking for it. They just, and that's what Bill Anders says, they discovered it. And this, I think, Stanley and Carrie sent me that link, and that's an interview fairly recent, and I think it's with PBS or NPR, and he's in Montana now. And the reason I include his wife is she's had Alzheimer's for several years, so it's kind of sad. That's his mission right now. But the interview is so laid back, and they one of the things they asked him was, after Apollo 8, I mean, you would be in line again to command another mission. He had no interest. He said he was considerate of his family, didn't want to run the risk. And he appreciated what the objectives were, and he accomplished them, and he was doing some other things. But he was just a real laid-back farm guy from Montana being interviewed after all these years. It was really enjoyable. And so, as I say, that was my favorite mission, so happy birthday. And that's a good read, and the postage stamp commemorated. Postage was a little cheaper back then. Now, a word about this entry checklist. We practice a lot. That's how all the flight controllers maintain proficiency in what they were doing. You had to simulate. And one of the things, happened to be on the entry team. So we're coming back from the moon, and there's no stopping us. I mean, the gravity is taking over. And so we have this heat shield, just like we did on the previous spacecraft, the Gemini and the Mercury. And because without it, the spacecraft is going to burn up. So there's a very narrow corridor, and it's like 5.5 degrees off the horizon to a little over 7 degrees off the horizon. This is our corridor. It looks kind of something like that. If we come in too shallow, we might have a chance to come back in again, but it might be the wrong ocean. If we come in too deep, we'll probably not survive. So it's vital that we come in at the proper attitude. And so we practice this and practice this. And the way we control the attitude of the spacecraft to aim that heat shield correctly is with, again, some reaction control jets right here, which are positioned in 90-degree quadrants around the spacecraft. Notice they're flush for aerodynamic reasons, and they're not used until entry. And so they're sitting there dormant for 6-7 days, getting cold, and so it's necessary to heat them up beforehand. So the directions go something like this. For those reaction control jets that are only about 100 pounds per thrust, that's their purpose. And we have to first heat them for about that long. But how do we heat them? Well, there's solenoid valves, old-fashioned solenoid valves. So we pump current through those coils and the solenoid valves to heat them up. And but the system is non-pressurized, so that's why it's important to turn those heaters off before we pressurize the system. Well, in one of the practice runs, the simulations, they did not. And so we pressurized, and we hosed out all the propellant, had no control, and the spacecraft came in nose first. And it would have burned up. But it was a simulation. So what was added to the checklist is, thou shalt pull the circuit breaker. But that's the purpose of simulations. And if I remember, I can't remember what the position was, but one of the crew members was Buzz Aldrin, of all people. So where were we? We've flown 2 Apollos now, so the next one is to test out this lunar module also. So this was an Earth orbital flight, Apollo 9, and in the spring of 1969. These are the crew people. Jim McDivitt is former Gemini, David Stock. Rusty Schweikert was a rookie. And it's important that I really put this here for me to remember that when the 2 spacecraft separate and go in different elliptical paths, when the ground wants to communicate them, are they going to say Apollo 9? Well, whom are they looking for? So the crew chose names to give each of the 2 spacecraft. And for this one, they chose for the spacecraft that kind of resembles a gumdrop. And this spindly lunar module they called Spider. So afterwards, if anybody's interested, I have some gumdrops here. I think there's enough for one for each. And spiders, I thought of bringing some in, but that probably wouldn't go over very well. So the next best thing is, so that's the last question on your handout. And there's your flapping alligator. And the lunar module is in right in there. So they turn around, they dock, they extract it. This is interesting. Rusty Schweikert did the extravehicular activity, and he had gotten sick to his tummy, and I mean, sick. And so we thought they were going to abort that part, but we came on, and the word was that he was going out, so he went out. Everything was fine. Heroes, all of them.
spacesuits in there.
Say again?
They come out of their
Yes,
spacesuits,
yes.
right? Where do they store all
I don't know, but I mean, that's part of the design. They just store that stuff. Because otherwise, it's going to be a mess. Okay, Apollo 10 was a dress rehearsal. Apollo 10's mission was to go into lunar orbit again and go into a deep elliptical orbit and get within 6 miles of the lunar surface. Well, a commercial airplane travels that altitude, so we're close. These are all Gemini veterans. And the two names there were Snoopy and Charlie Brown. And Charlie Brown was the command module, and Snoopy was the lunar module. And when they were in that low Earth orbit, I think it was Tom Stafford that called to Houston. That was Charlie Duke to Capcom at that time. He says, "We're down among them." Now, at the end of their lunar orbit part, they separated the lunar module, if you remember, is 2 parts. So they separated from here. This went into a trajectory into the moon, and the 2 crew members, it was Stafford and Cernan, they were in this part, and they rendezvoused with the command module. Well, during the rendezvous sequence, this particular switch right here, the abort guidance system, the switch was in the wrong configuration, and it was in auto rather than attitude hold. Attitude hold was, as the name implies, the spacecraft was to hold its attitude. In auto, it started to search for the spacecraft and started to tumble and was virtually out of control. It was a matter of, they were fully suited, probably with gloves, and somebody just messed up and had the switch in the wrong position. Well, they corrected that, and then as we often did, as often as possible, we used our coffee money to buy beer and met with the 3 crew members afterwards, typically maybe a week or so after they landed, and debriefed. And so we did this, and we gave them this memento. Okay, Apollo 11. We know probably a whole lot about this. Now, during the descent stage, the onboard computer emitted what was called the 1201 alarm. That's just a code for a particular alarm. And what was happening, it was just getting overloaded. And so the guidance, or the crew would keep relaying to the ground 1201 alarm, 1201 alarm. And Steve Bales was the flight controller on console. He was the guido. And Jack Garman, real sharp guy, University of Michigan graduate, who I worked for MIT, and MIT had designed all the software. He was in the support room across the hall, and Garman relayed to, so it was this back and forth between the guy in the back room and the guy in the front room, and Garman kept saying, "We are go." So long as that's intermittent, because otherwise, if we couldn't determine that without unequivocally, we would have had to abort and not land. But so this team of 2 guys really saved that mission during the descent stage. Now, you can't read this, but this is a timely email dated May 23, 2018. We talked about the restoration of the control room. What this thing is, need help locating a copy of the display Steve Bales used for monitoring the landing on the moon. So they want that, if they can get that on the cathode ray tube display, they want to have that as part of the show, what the display he was looking at during that actual phase. I included this because this was about the quality of the TV. Those of you who are old enough to remember. It was black and white, of course. I have the flight plan there on the table if you're welcome to look at it afterwards. The reason I include that is a kind of a reminder to me that well, let me finish this and then I'll tell you that story. I included now Bob Redingham came in with a copy of the New York Times, which he has framed. I chose the Buffalo Evening News because I delivered this paper. Not that issue, but that paper put me through high school. Of course, like a lot of papers, it's not in existence anymore, but we had two papers, evening and morning, and that was their version. And this was the December '69 issue of National Geographic. You've seen this with Jeremy's opener, but there I am. I had a little more hair then, but not much. Okay, earlier someone said, well, where were you exactly on the lunar landing? And you remember the slide I had where it showed the recorders, the chart recorders in the back. So that's what our back room looked like. And I remember anticipating a very crowded back room. And so I got up, ate breakfast, and came in very early, probably 3 hours before landing, and plugged in. I had my headset, and I plugged in at this table. There was an outlet. But the reason I brought this was what the headset looked like. That was the jack that went into the table. I mean, that thing was probably about the size of this Milky Way. So what do we got now? A little coax that plugs into the side of your computer. But I just thought this was fascinating. That, and all it did was provided an intercom capability. The headset itself was pretty nice. It was very lightweight. But this was neat. Anyway, I plugged in back there and just got the heck out of the way. Postage went up in a mere, 7 months? Almost doubled.
That was their mail there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's more expensive.
And if any of you have seen First Man, these are the crews. So Ryan Gosling played the part of Neil, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins. Now this guy's interesting. Who's seen Witness? That story about that? He was the Amish kid, Samuel. And some of the other characters. I don't think this is a very good rendition of Robert Gilruth or Chris Kraft, but maybe. Excellent movie, but see it before they pull it because it's not making any money at the box office. The sound is phenomenal. It's a story about Neil, really. It's all about Neil Armstrong. All right, Apollo 12. And this is a special mission all its own, as you will see. Alan Bean is a rookie. Gordon and Conrad were co-crew members on one of the later Gemini missions. This was the one that got hit by lightning, and it destroyed the, all the memory in the instrumentation ring around that. So we launched this thing through a lightning storm, and this was what they lost all the data in there. So it's flying blind essentially on backup batteries. And meet John Aaron. Bachelor's of Science degree from Southwest Oklahoma State University in Edmondson. Tell them to take SCE to AUX. So here we've seen this room layout before, and what you're going to hear is back and forth between Jerry Griffin, the flight director, and John Aaron, Econ.
November 14, 1969, Apollo 12. Astronauts Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, and Alan Bean are headed for the second moon landing. The need to make a fast decision is about to fall on controller John Aaron. He's in charge of electrical and environmental systems. His call sign, Econ.
the thing that makes a good econ is a natural curiosity about how things work, even if you are not responsible for them.
Apollo 12 lifts off. It's Jerry Gregory's first launch as flight director.
And all of a sudden everything, all the data went away, and there was a big static in my headset. I said, Econ, what do you see?
I looked down at all of my telemetry data, the readouts from the spacecraft, and they were nonsensical.
My favorite word.
In this spacecraft, astronaut Alan Dean has no clue either.
The lights pop on. The alarm system comes on. More lights than I'd ever seen ever in the simulator. I mean, there was main bus A, main bus B.
It's an electrical failure. The command module has lost main power. Emergency batteries take over, but they'll only last 2 hours. Mission Control is facing a launch abort, jettison the spacecraft, and blow up the Saturn V. Now John Aaron's curiosity pays off. A year earlier, during the test, he had seen a strange pattern of data and had learned about an obscure switch inside the command module that could fix it.
I had seen that pattern before, and it had been 1 year since I had seen it. But it was like that pattern was written in my mind.
The Saturn V's engines keep burning, but the command module on top of the rocket is barely alive, powered only by emergency batteries. Everyone expects Econ to abort. Then Aaron makes a different call.
I said, Flight, tell them to take the SCE to Ox.
And I said, what?
SCE to Ox.
I said, what's that?
It was some obscure switch, signal condition electronics auxiliary.
I turned to the Capcom and Jerry Carr and I said, and Carr said, what?
Mission Control comes back and says,
turned out Al Dean knew where that switch was. It was back over his shoulder. He threw the switch and we got all of our data back and we could see what the problem was.
We got it back, fine, looks good. Okay.
Reveals Apollo 12 had been hit by lightning, which traveled down the rocket's exhaust to the ground, knocking the spacecraft's main electrical system offline. The obscure SCE switch wasn't designed for this situation, but it works.
Thank God for mission control. Thank God for mission control. I didn't have any idea what to do.
Pete Conrad broke out in nervous laughter. He laughed all the way into orbit.
So, John Aaron became a rock star. And these are available online, I'm told. In fact, I'll prove it to you. Sarah? SCE dogs. Keep calm. John Aaron was, of course, the front room guy. His support engineer, Jim Kelly, who you'll meet later also, he was right across the hall, and that was his comment about T-shirts. I said, you know, Jim, these are available, and that was his comment. I edited it a little bit. But anyway, that was his comment about SCE dogs and T-shirts and coffee mugs and so on. Okay, and then finally, Apollo 13, and of course Ron Howard's movie by the same name is phenomenal, and it's very, very accurate. It was Ken Mattingly here that had to be removed from the mission very, very shortly before launch and replaced with Jack Schweiker, who was a command module expert. He was a pilot. He was ready to go. He was a member of the backup team. But Ken didn't have measles, but he had been exposed to measles. And there was no way that they were going to risk someone coming down with any sort of disease like that while we're that far away from the Earth. Ultimately, Ken did get a mission. He flew opposite John Young and Charlie Duke on Apollo 16, the second last mission. So this was right after the TV transmission. And that was the explosion that we were able to discover after we separated from the spacecraft and photographed it. That was just an artist's rendering. But what happened was, of course, we had this short in the, again, oxygen, pure oxygen, and it blew the 1/4 of the panel right off the service module. So the service module was useless. So we had to go into what they call a lifeboat mode and use the lunar module, which was designed for 2 people, not 3. And it did not have that kind of a fuel budget. Somehow or other we were going to have to configure that to get us back from the Earth. So normally the lunar module would have served its purpose and be jettisoned right after we left rendezvoused in lunar orbit. But we had to bring it home. So we were able to use the lunar gravity to give us what we call a slingshot effect, and use its gravity to speed up the spacecraft, the pair of spacecraft, without having to do any burns for acceleration, not yet anyway. And we just used the lunar gravity to give us a push back. And then we did some mid-course corrections with the lunar module to eventually get home in on the ocean and get recovery. It was well, you can imagine what a team effort it was. And everybody came on board. We had practiced it some, but it was definitely an anomaly. But there's an example of young guys in their 20s, most of them, fantastic problem solvers, able to think on their feet and handle the unexpected and the unknown, really. John Aaron also made himself famous here because again, the lunar module was designed for 2 people. We had 3 there, and the carbon dioxide was becoming poisonous, so we had to configure jury rig, some sort of a filter using available materials, some of which was duct tape, and John was definitely played a role in that design. But it worked. It worked. And there's the crew on the carrier afterwards. I didn't like that picture because it's kind of grainy, so there's the equivalent, but it's black and white, but it's better resolution. Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Schweiker. And there's the control room afterwards. Now, I came across this picture recently. If that's not me, I don't know who it is. So I guess it is me. There's some of the guys I work with. There's Charlie S. Meyer, another Air Force guy, but all these guys were G&C folks, so we were all on the same team one time or another. So that's a great photo. I love that one. We got the Presidential Medal of Freedom, signed by Richard Nixon. That was to the whole operations team, so everybody got a copy of this. This I thought was just funny. This is a bill, an invoice from Grumman Aircraft, who built the lunar module, addressed to North American Rockwell, who built the command module, which was, of course, rather the service module, which was, of course, disabled. You can probably read this a little bit better, but they're charging for towing fee $4 for the first mile and $1 each additional mile for how many miles? A total of $400,000 plus dollars. They presented this afterwards. After things calmed down and the control room cleared out, we all went over to Ellington Air Force Base Officers Club and had lunch and drank a lot of beer. And the Grumman people were there, and they recited this to the Rockwell North American people. It did not go over very big with Rockwell. Not at all. Some happy guys. And of course, Ed Harris made Gene Kranz famous. There we are smoking again. Glen Delaney, he and I were dorm mates, as I said. He was portrayed by Mark McClure. Lauren Dean played John Aaron. And now, I suppose you thought all this was a guys' club, and primarily it was. But I want you to meet Poppy Northcutt. And she was quite a lady. She got her degree in math in 3 years from UT Austin. And eventually got her law degree while she was a flight controller at NASA. And became very active in the National Organization for Women. But of course, you have to hand it to her because she was one of hundreds of guys. But very, very smart lady. So in the future, we played some golf. Alan Shepard, I think, shot a 6-iron or something in Apollo 14. After his first suborbital shot, he was grounded because he had an inner ear anomaly, but they cleared that up and cleared him to fly, and so he trained for Apollo 14. And of course, as a result of 13, there was this hiatus for, I think, the better part of a year before the Apollo 14 flew, so he had time to get up to speed. And of course, then we also were able to move about and drive on the moon, and this was a huge improvement because we were able to cover some real territory, leave the lunar module for a couple of miles in the later missions. All right, now Apollo 15, they did a little experiment to prove Galileo's theory. Come here, Josh. You can do this. So hold them high and then just let them go at the same time. And of course, the hammer is going to hit first. Well, that's because we're here on Earth. Thank you very much. But on the moon, it's different.
On my left hand, I have a feather.
This is David Scott.
I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago, who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. And the feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon. And I'll drop the two of them here and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that? Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings.
Who is that?
David Scott.
Scott?
Yeah. All right, so here's another iconic picture of the Earth, almost the entire sphere. You can see the continent of Africa, Saudi Arabia, and I just thought that was a beautiful picture of the Earth. But we talk about iconic pictures. For flight controllers, folks, for flight controllers, this is the iconic picture.
Yeah.
Now, I mentioned that these crew members were heroes, and landing at night on an aircraft carrier is nothing because all the Apollo missions were daytime launches. Well, I lied. Apollo 17, the last one, was a night launch. And I kept these because the shots, the photos are just gorgeous. All right. Now, Jeremy, where's Jeremy? Do we have loaded the, all right, just click, all right. Apollo 17 liftoff from the moon. If you wanted to do this on your home computer, just Google that. Ed Fendell became expert in controlling the camera that was on the moon. Now, we know how far the moon is from the Earth and how fast light travels. So he's got to anticipate where he's got to point that camera.
Get your arms down. Okay, I'm going to get the pro. 99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Burn away, Houston. That's your good. Back side. jet fast. Okay, 30 seconds. 308 your number. Take off your 1500 feet, and 8 dot looks good.
And I've seen comments on the web, you know, well, that's there was no camera up there. Yes, there was, and it was controlled by Ed from the ground. So I always get teary-eyed at this point because that was the last mission. And this is about what's left. A lot of footprints, some flags. The other thing, of course, we're at the end of our talk. So a few comments from John Aaron. This is a great read also. And this is Jim Kelly's comments, his support guy across the hall. And Jim furnished that to me a few months ago. Thought-provoking. This lady is the now director of the Manned Spacecraft Center, the Johnson Space Center. And this is Jim's wife, Brenda. And there's one more picture of Jim and Brenda just before they got married. John was his best man, and you know this guy. The two of us were in Jim's wedding. And this is their latest logo, which I love. So I'll close with this question. Where do we go from here? I'm not going to answer that, but you are. You are. These are questions for the younger set. How about you? Where are we going to go? I think Jeff Bales had an interesting concept. He said, move all the industrial and the storage and all that, move that either into near Earth orbit or to the moon. Mars, gosh, that's a long haul one way. Of course, is Congress going to buy anything like this? Remember, the money rolled in. We had this charge from then President Kennedy. And it was a perfect storm, I feel. You know, the stars were aligned, pardon the pun, and we had the money and the national interest, but I don't know if we have it now. I love that logo. Some interesting readings. This Gene Kranz's book. I'm doing this one. I recommend that. That's a great story. Some other sites you might visit.
You got that one slide?
I didn't hear you. Could back up? You bet. This one's interesting. Don Nilsson, a retired aerospace engineer at NASA, he worked through the shuttle. And what he calls NASA letters were a bunch of emails he sent to NASA administrators. He was very, very knowledgeable, but he was telling them that he's in favor of a reusable spacecraft like the shuttle, not an expendable spacecraft like that we used on Apollo, not at all. I'm sure he made a royal pain in the butt with NASA administrators. It got to the point they didn't even answer his emails anymore. But it's good reading because it's very, very thought-provoking. All right, some of the guys that are still around, Glen Delaney, Fred Hayes, Lunar Module pilot on Apollo 13, Chris Kraft, Gene Kranz. This was, I think, recently at the opening of the first man. And I just want to thank you for hearing my story. Keep in mind, there were about 200 flight controllers there. You've heard one. There's 199 other stories. Yes, sir?
So I got a question. You've mentioned several of the movies. We've got The Right Stuff, Apollo 13, Hidden Figures, and now First Flight. So you more than anybody in this room probably could tell us how much of those, which is the least Hollywood-wooded, if you will, of those, most accurate, and which one did you like?
I think Ron Howard's Apollo 13. The others were definitely Hollywood, especially Right Stuff, you know. But was thrilling, and that's what Hollywood does. They make interesting movies. But I think Ron was the most accurate. I like First Man, but it's a different approach. It's about Neil. What I didn't know, and I hope I'm not giving away the story, he lost a young girl, his daughter at 2, from cancer. And so that affected him his whole life. And you can see that reflected in his decision-making, his speech, and so on. For example, when he was asked, well, how did you feel, Neil, when you were named commander of Apollo 11? His answer was, I was pleased. And I'm sure that's accurate because they have the transcripts. And as I said, the photography and the sound is phenomenal. But it's not making any money.
I think people didn't like the fact that the American flag wasn't.
That wasn't part of it at all, I didn't think. I really don't think it was. I mean, it's in the background. You can't see it, but the action of actually placing the... but they didn't show the placing of the plaque either. We have come in peace for all mankind. That wasn't meant. But this was a story about Neil. Anyway, then Hidden Figures, I think that was historically good because we learned some. Again, I use the expression perfect storm. The guys were all fighting World War II. And these ladies went to historically black colleges. Why? Because they couldn't go anywhere else. And they had some phenomenal instruction. And they were smart. They were smart. So, I mean, that's a piece of history. How accurate it is, I don't know. That 57 Chevy, I'd love to get my hands on that.
Yeah, but the Hidden Figures, the term computer, came from what those women did because they were called.
They were computerists or something, yes. Yeah.
Got carried over to the hardware.
Yeah. There was another question, I think.
Well, I'm curious about something. You made a reference to from a flight controller standpoint, the key piece with the iconic piece with the parachutes.
Yes. Those are my words, but...
Yeah, but I'm just curious, considering that we went from water landing to reusable landings on a hard surface, and now we're going back to water landings with Orion, how did that strike you when you heard that? Because the Orion...
I have no answer. It didn't strike me. Water landing is compared to the equivalent that the Soviets were using way back when. They were using parachutes on land. I think the water landing was... But we had the Navy. You know, the Russians didn't have the oceans. We had the Navy. And here's something I mentioned to Jeremy that I read in Kluger's book, that the admiral, and I don't know if... I don't think he was chief of naval operations. I think he was commander of the Pacific Fleet. The admiral that made the call on Apollo 8 to rescue that capsule, get that capsule out of the ocean, because this was a quickly put together mission plan. His name was John McCain. Not John McCain the senator, John McCain the father. Yes?
You mentioned the camera and the camera controller. Was there one camera that was reused, or when was it placed for each?
That one went to each site, each landing site, because the landing sites were entirely different and they weren't close together at all. So there was one camera that, I mean, I'm sure it was the same camera, but different, same model, different cameras. Yes?
First of all, thank you so much. It's very striking to me.
Oh, well, I'm glad. And then I did my job, because I sure enjoy doing this.
The question is what it was like living in a culture of getting things absolutely correct with checklists and how that worked. What was it like when you had to get it absolutely right every time?
Well, I don't think we did every time. I mean, there were, but that's why you had more than one crew member backing up. Someone in the back room would be doing the numbers, and someone else would be double checking them. It's definitely a buddy system. If you were on Gene Kranz's team, you better get it right, because he was a taskmaster. Yeah. And it was not unusual for him to break a pencil and put it in one of those pneumatic tubes and send it to you. There was a question here, I think. Yes.
You gave me this hat in 1994.
I did indeed.
When you came back from the 25th reunion.
Yes, 1994.
You also had an interaction with Neil.
Yes.
That was, can you say that?
Yeah, I can, it was Neil and Buzz, both, 2 out of the 3 crew members. I'll talk about my conversation with Buzz Aldrin. It was shortly after I got here, and Buzz, they hadn't even assigned the Apollo 11 crew yet. And they hadn't even flown Apollo 7. But we were, all the Air Force guys had to, what they call a dining in. And traditionally that was an excuse to put on your uniform. I got it in one of my backup slides. Put on your mess dress uniform, go out and have prime ribs and drink a bunch of martinis and so on, and just, just act stupid. And we had a guest speaker. It was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Can't remember his name, doesn't matter. And seating was totally random, so I go up to my seat because it's got my name on it, and I says, "Hi, I'm Bill Weppner," and this guy says, "I'm Buzz Aldrin." I said, "Oh, hi," And thank God I didn't say something like, "Are you an astronaut?" But I had just finished a workshop, it's a 2 or 3 day workshop on crew systems. And part of the crew system was what we call waste management. And so we got to talking, and he said, "That's definitely a problem. Definitely a problem, obviously." So fast forward to after the Apollo 11 crew, again, the flight controllers got together, and after the crew, we had to wait until they got out of quarantine, but eventually we got together and drank a lot of beer and spent our coffee money, and nature being what it is, you drink a lot of beer, it's got to go somewhere. So I used the restroom, and as I'm coming out, who's walking in but Neil Armstrong? And so what do we got in common? We talk about potties, Neil and Buzz and me. Those were the only 2 conversations I had with either one of them. Hi, Neil. Yeah. How things going? Hi, Buzz. Bill.
Yeah, I'm sure over the years you've worked up a snappy comeback to people who think none of this ever happened and it was all staged in Hollywood. Would you?
One of my combats is, and there's a Flat Earth Society too.
Yeah, they're
Well, realistically, you know how Washington leaks. Had this been staged for over 50 years, somebody would have leaked it. If you watch Mythbusters, they've destroyed some of these myths. And there is a website, I can't tell you for the life of me what it is, but if you look at myths, they take about over a dozen. And they say, okay, this one, the lighting is such, the shadows and so on, it had to be staged. And then they'll explain, well, the reflection off the lunar surface was immense. Very, very bright reflection. And so that's why you get the shadows in unexpected angles and so on. So it pretty much explains each one of these.
Well, I like the flat Earth comment.
Yeah. Well, I had to use that at my high school, as a matter of fact. A young junior, senior, he asked a question like that, and I gave him about that answer. And my nephew was in the audience, and he said, "Atta go, Uncle Bill!" Yeah. What else?
What about the radiation?
Minor, no problem at all. Nothing to speak of. I have some gumdrops here. If you want to come up and take a look at the flight plan, you may. One thing I forgot, I get this stuff, and then if I don't have it out, I forget about it. This is the flag we all had on Apollo 11. It's getting kind of old, but it's... You guys going to give me the hook?
Is microphone on? Yeah. Okay, since we're wrapping up tonight, first of all, are there any other questions? One.
How much is that flag worth now?
Oh. To me, a whole lot. She's got the 2 best questions of the night.